In a typical UK theatre audience, 7 out of 10 people will be women. This isn't new. Surveys in the 80s showed a similar picture. At that time, much like today, the most important and prestigious jobs in theatre were held by men. Women faced a glass ceiling made of stone.
I remember when everything from going to see the accountants to the lawyers to anybody else, we were kind of treated as girls who needed a bit of fatherly help and advice.
Yeah.
In this episode, 3 theatre professionals unpack the challenges for women and women's theatre in the 1980s.
Well, I suppose at Arts Admin we, in a sense, were forging our own place because we were working in that field of kind of performance, alternative theatre, work that didn't quite fit into anybody else's categories. So we were in a lone furrow to begin with. And Arts Admin was started by Judith Knight and Shona Stewart in 1979. And we were an all-woman organisation for our first probably 15 or 20 years. We didn't employ any men. I mean, we worked with some male artists. And when we did employ a man, John Ashford joined us for a while after I think he'd been at the place. And
he was at the ICA at some point.
Yes, I think this might have been after the ICA then. But he, when he was working for us, he was great. He was a pleasure to work with. But when people from outside came in, oh, can we talk to the governor?
Yeah.
Was the approach always.
He was an extraordinary artistic director because at the ICA, I very early on took a play by Melissa Murray about 3 women getting drunk and talking about their lives. And he produced it for us. We did it there at the ICA. And I remember once stopping to say thanks to him. And he said, well, I have to confess, I hate the play, but I thought I should be doing work that I didn't like, not just reflected me. I've never heard any other artistic director say.
Rare. Yes, I mean, the kind of influential women that we were working with, and we weren't particularly influential at that time. We were financially struggling as a young organisation, as Arts Admin, and seeing lots of influential women in Europe. There were sort of people running venues and being quite big producers, but we weren't seeing that for ourselves in England. And the same for the artists, to be honest. The artists were getting big fees in Europe and struggling in England. Yeah. So that was quite a parallel. But, I mean, I suppose the woman artist that we worked with in the 80s, who was quite high profile or is now, is Bobby Baker.
Right.
And, I mean, Bobby was sort of... She forged her own way with her very kind of personal performance work.
Yeah.
And Jerry Pilgrim, was she?
Jerry was in and out of Arts Admin. I mean, Jerry was around with the People's Show in when she had her company, and she was based then in the People's Show studios. And then she did bits of work in and out of Arts Admin in the early days, but then she went off and had her own funding for a while and her own company.
What was her company called?
Oh,
I know, I'm just trying...
Hesitate and Demonstrate.
Hesitate and Demonstrate, that's right, yes.
Yeah, she was very early influential performance artist.
And often people now who see shows like Punch Drunk don't really know about Jerry Pilgrim's work.
No.
Which is really sad.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, that amazing show at Toynbee Studios, or Toynbee House Hall, rather, and an amazing show in immersive theatre in the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital and so on. Just some incredible stuff that transformed the space.
It's true of a lot of people who do physical and performance work now. They have no idea of all the work that was developing through the 60s and into the 70s, which is sad.
In terms of what was going on in the 80s, I remember I would go through Time Out magazine on a weekly basis, and then later City Limits. And I would underline every time I saw a woman writer or a woman director. There were few and far between, but there were certain venues where the work was happening. And I hung out a lot at Oval House under Kate Crutchley, who programmed such a fascinating array of work. And that obviously is where Judith Knight and Shona Stewart had both started. Also at Soho. So when did you start at Soho?
I started as associate in 83, I think, and I took over as artistic director in 84.
Right, so I was at Soho, going to the Soho Poly when you were there.
And we did quite a lot of female playwrights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and then the drill hall. And there were probably a few other places where,
Yeah.
things happened from time to time. But it was all, the alternative venues
Yeah.
where the work was happening. And a very, very few, in Royal Court maybe, Max Stafford Clark, whose name we're no longer allowed to mention
We're
positively.
allowed to mention it.
But actually, he did an amazing amount of work in terms of supporting women playwrights, actually. Developing Carol Churchill's work with joint stock and so on, and helping her sort of find the context in which to develop amazing plays like Cloud Nine and Light Shining in Buckinghamshire and so forth. So that model of writing was obviously really important, and collaborating with actors and then later with dancers and other artists and so on, really important in terms of her experiment. So I was kind of going to see, whenever I could afford it, any woman playwright I could find. And there were not a lot in the mainstream. I think Theatre of Black Women brought their show Chiaroscuro to Soho.
Soho, did they?
Yeah.
When I was there.
I think it would have been in the 80s.
Because I left in 88 and I went to Greenwich, and I employed women directors there, Sue Wilson and Penny Churns, and put on plays by Wendy MacLeod, American, Melissa Murray, but got accused of, what was it? Somebody on the board said, there are too many ladies around here and not enough meat. It wasn't a pleasant environment to work in at Greenwich. But there weren't many role models for us or other women working in establishment theatre. We were all in alternative theatre. So that's what led to the Standing Conference of Women Theatre Directors and Administrators, and our quest with that to put pressure on the establishment to employ and nurture women directors and playwrights. Have you any thoughts about that kind of pressure on the establishment or that interaction?
I think it was everywhere.
Yeah.
And I remember when everything from going to see the accountants to the lawyers to anybody else, we were kind of treated as girls who needed a bit of fatherly help and advice.
Yeah.
And that really sticks,
Yeah.
that was how we were treated. And I'm sure with a lot of the older men working in theatre, we were seen the same way. These kind of young women trying to forge ahead with this company. And it was hard to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
Really hard. And with the funders too. I mean, for arts admin, because we were producing funded shows, the Arts Council thought funding us would be double funding. And they repeatedly told us that. If we are giving the show money for an administrator, then that's enough for you. And it took years and years to get arts admin funded as its own organisation with its own artistic plans, etc.
The Arts Council could be very helpful but also very obtuse. I remember endless arguments about they give you money for workshop work for writers, and I'd be saying, but what really helps a writer to develop are productions, especially at somewhere like the Soho. We turn over, we were doing 6 or 7 productions a year paid, and that really moves a writer on. And that was really hard to get through to them because it was a bit more expensive.
Yeah, I started going mid-80s to various Standing Conference events. And I know they also had events which I think they sort of sponsored at the Drill Hall, where you could, as a young woman aspiring to be a director, which is what I was at that point, you could go along and meet other women directors, older women directors, and hear about their experience. And that was really important. In fact, I've been talking to a young woman of 3 years out from university recently, and she's saying there's nothing like that now, and that they want that sort of sense of, mentorship and passing on experience, and how important that is. And then Women's Playhouse Trust, which just in terms of the visibility both of women writers, directors, and actually women's history in the theatre, and the fact that they put on The Lucky Chance, an Afro-Ben play, at a time when, nobody was putting on Afro-Ben. They then went on and did the Rover at the RSC and so on. So, and then did Entezaki Shanga's Spell Number 7. So this, African-American work, early work, that was so really important. But then the other thing which I went to is they had a series of workshops about putting women centre stage, which included some workshops using psychodrama for women to kind of look at what were the obstacles, the internalised obstacles to success. You know, the fact that you hadn't been brought up to consider yourself as having any authority, and then obviously bank managers and so on are assuming that you don't have any authority equally. So how are you going to build up that sense of being a director, being a person in charge when the whole of socialisation has worked against that? Yeah. And that was fascinating.
Standing Conference of Women Theatre Directors and Administrators, the worst title in the world, was very influential over that first 2 or 3 years. And then Women's Playhouse, 82 to about 83, 84. And then Women's Playhouse Trust came out of that. I had to argue with the ICA to be able to have a women-only event. And there was a big all-women event at the Young Vic, which had all the writers you can think of, Carol Churchill, Beryl Bainbridge, Angela Carter. That was an extraordinarily influential conference. And then it was out of those discussions that Pam Gems, me, Sue Parish, Rosemary Squire decided to start Women's Playhouse Trust. And then Jules Wright joined us. And when some of us drifted off, Jules continued it. And it had a big influence, apart from the fact that we never got the theatre. And I still think there's room for a theatre dedicated to women's work, directing, acting and writing.
And I think the other key thing that they did, and then subsequently Women's Theatre Group, or Sphinx as it became, did was gathering the statistics.
Yes, the survey came from the standing conference.
Yeah, and then Women's Playhouse Trust did a follow-up to it and so on, and then Sphinx has done further follow-ups. But actually saying, OK, how many women are employed in what roles, and particularly in
that first survey, which was in 82, 83, was incredibly
directors and then artistic directors, and how many women playwrights are getting produced and so on. And then there's a correlation that you can see immediately when there are women in charge, that they are doing more work by women.
There are very few women in charge of establishment companies. And the major female playwright, was Agatha Christie. Yeah. When you get the numbers of women playwrights, 40 odd as opposed to 300 odd men or whatever, the main productions would be Agatha Christie. So it wasn't they weren't generating new women playwrights at the time.
And some of the sexism, there was a quote which maybe it was apocryphal in some level, but a male artistic director saying, of course I'd employ a woman, I'd also employ a one-legged Chilean refugee. And it was equally absurd, the idea of employing a woman as a director.
I can't remember whether it's Standing Conference or Women's Playhouse Trust, but we went to meet with the artistic directorship at the National Theatre, and they were all men. And they brought Gillian Diamond, who was a casting director. She was fantastic. She came and sat on the side of the table with us and argued with them. They couldn't understand. Their stance was, we employ the best. And when you tried to examine what the best was, it was them. So it was a circular argument. But I think it did have its impact in later decades.
Yeah, I think they would employ an occasional woman to do a platform performance.
Yeah, Julia Pascal had worked there. I think the only woman at that point to have ever directed at the National Theatre.
Yeah, and then at the RSC, I think they would have a woman staff director, and then they'd get rid of, or she'd leave.
Assistant directors, like
and
me.
And then another woman would come in, and then she'd leave, and
exactly.
That was the only space.
It was through those organisations and our work when we were in leadership positions that we were pushing for more equality. What about work on South Africa, or with anti-apartheid, or with the miners' strike, which was 84 to 85?
Well, with South Africa, it's quite interesting that just through the luck of knowing Mary Benson, that my relationship was with the ANC. And that, in a sense, was far easier and more direct. And the anti-apartheid movement probably didn't like what I was doing very much because they felt it was muddying the waters.
Right.
All the shows that we brought had been approved by the ANC people in South Africa, and they all came through the Market Theatre. So there was a kind of quality control through Barney Simon on the work, because of course you couldn't go there and see it. It was quite difficult to negotiate through, particularly in the UK, actually. And I remember when I brought You Strike the Woman, You Strike the Rock, and it came with lift.
Oh, right, yeah.
And we were playing the Tricycle, Riverside, and I think it was the Albany. We did a week in each area of London. And I had a real struggle with the anti-apartheid movement in Hammersmith. They were basically saying that I must be exploiting these people. And then the women in Strike the Woman, they just laid into the guy who was leading the anti-apartheid movement and saw him off, basically. That was quite complex in that we were working sort of circumventing almost the anti-apartheid movement in the UK, who were supposedly garnering the support for the ANC and for what was happening in South Africa. So it was quite a complex relationship that happened across those areas. But they were very powerful women who, no matter what had happened to them in South Africa, they certainly found their voices when they were touring internationally. Yeah. They travelled all over the world and earned quite a lot of money, because at that time all of the support for anti-apartheid was coming through every venue, and Scandinavia was sort of really supportive, and a lot of mainland Europe. So they toured for years, almost constantly.
At Soho, we had a lot to do with the striking miners. Yeah. All alternative theatre did then. We couldn't give any proceeds from a production because of Arts Council rules, but we did a Sunday night benefit, because we didn't perform Sundays then, and then a bucket collection for miners who came down. And out of that relationship, so it was miners' wives and miners who came down, we organised Here We Go, the miners' wives benefit at the Piccadilly Theatre in the end of November 1984, which was a fantastic event, and every well-known actress you can think of then, Juliet Stevenson, Jane Lapotaire, Julie Walters, they were all on stage doing their thing. And the women came down in coach loads. And that was a fantastic event.
I remember People Show doing some work around some of that, because they toured with the Flying Pickets.
Yes, of course.
Which came out of the Half Moon. Yes. And so People Show toured the cabaret alongside the Flying Pickets.
Yeah. What did you have to know of supporting other?
Well, I was coming up to see some of that work, but 84, 85 initially in Colchester, and so they were bringing coal in through Wivenhoe, so we were going down to join the pickets there, and also did as the Vic Katzi Ensemble, we did a cabaret, I think, in the student bar to support the miners and so on. But so I wasn't very directly involved in that, but I do remember Sizwe players coming over. So, and would that have been like 88 or something?
It was 86.
86, okay. Well, it was earlier than
Lift, and then
I remember.
They toured then for several years all over the place.
But I remember, because there's a nice link there for Conference of Women Theatre Directors and Administrators, I produced a conference because we saw that there were a number of shows which were centrally focused on women or directed by women in the Lift Festival. And they were on a larger scale, because one of the key stereotypes about women directors, which was traded around at the time, was women were okay on the sort of small scale domestic
educational theatre,
or in little space for looking at family dynamic or whatever it might be. But large scale plays like Pravda, which was on around that time at the National Theatre and had a cast of about 23, I think it was. That sort of meaty work which showed a whole society, that stuff couldn't be done by women because they only worked on that small scale. And trying to explode those stereotypes, saying, well, actually, women can do that work. We're just not given the resources and the large spaces to work in. That needed to be challenged. And as late as the 90s, I think Nicholas Heitner was still coming out with that sort of stuff about women directors and what they could or couldn't do.
That brings me to Pam Gems, who was one of the biggest feminist names in that period. She sent, I think, Camille or Queen Christina, one of them, to the co-directors of the Royal Court, and they sent it back to her because it would be more interesting to women, more attractive to women than men. I mean, it was very, very blatant. There's no consciousness that women were over 50% of the audience, which was one of the things we discovered in the survey, that more women were going to the theatre than men, and often it was women who took their male partners, if they had male partners, to the theatre, and yet all the establishment theatres were run by men at that time.
And this is still the case. There was something in one of the weekend newspapers about the fact that most theatre tickets are booked by women, and men go along because they're being taken, but they rarely instigate.
Yeah.
As a kind of very general rule in a family situation.
And the women then are making the choices, and so
exactly.
you need to actually address them in your publicity.
Were there major female voices that were speaking out for women's theatre outside of alternative theatre?
I guess there was starting to be work at the Royal Court, to some extent, more women there. But
Carol Churchill.
Carol Churchill was kind of the key one.
Yes, she was the key writer. Sarah Daniels.
Yes,
Her
Masterpieces
work was
important.
There were so few women in leadership positions in that world. Privately, I know that women who were establishment administrators like Janista McIntosh and Gillian Diamond were supportive, but they weren't speaking out publicly about the discrimination, really, the lack of representation.
I know that the Conference of Women Theatre Directors and Administrators did an event, and I'm not quite sure what the year was, called The Casting of the Woman Theatre Administrator, and about the sort of stereotypes which attached to her. And as you say now, it's not called administrator anymore, which sort of tends to suggest a support role. Producer has much more status in itself, and that's actually what was happening. I mean, this was the often single individual who was supporting a whole company and doing the booking and the marketing and the fundraising and the sponsorship, if any, and all of that, but was seen as this sort of support role. And, was she your mum? Was she your accountant? What was all these stereotypes which attached to the
It was all about
the
facilitating and not about being the managing. There was
managing
no
it or
it.
being the creator, because the producer can be
Well,
very creative.
Producer has now really morphed into creative producer.
Yes,
most producers are now titled in that way,
or executive producer, or
senior,
general manager.
Or there's definitely
there's a kind of
a shift
of leveling up rather than it being male artistic director, woman helpmate and supporter in the administrative role.
How did you feel we were as we moved into the 90s? Did you feel that we were on the verge of change, or the change was developing, or?
I suppose a lot of the work I was still doing then was around the South African story. And interestingly, I suppose, with work coming here from South Africa, it was coming from the Market Theatre, which to the rest of the world was like the National Theatre. And it was primarily run by two men, Manny Manham and Barney Simon. But there were women in quite key roles artistically around a lot of the work there. People like Vanessa Cook and Janice Honeyman, who were beginning to direct and have proper roles. And then when the shows were coming overseas, it was really about what work was available and was approved by the kind of ANC people there. It didn't feel that there were quite so many barriers necessarily everywhere, because there was a whole fight going on against the kind of the big oppression in South Africa. And that was a slightly different fight. It was quite complex then as things were changing and the country was slowly changing and moving towards Mandela coming out of prison, etc. Then the focus became far more on if you're a white director or a black director and where you repositioned. And someone like Phyllis Klotz, who directed Strike the Woman, she just blazed through everything. And she left her white family in Cape Town and moved to Joburg with Small and Daba, who was another director. And they set up Sibikwa Arts, which was a training and theatre company in the township, working with all young people. And she's just retired now.
I think there were a number of success stories which meant you felt that things were beginning to change. So I'm thinking in particular of, say, Annie Castledine going to Derby Playhouse, where she programmed The Innocent Mistress by Mary Picks, first time it had been ever done since the Restoration, and Gerlind Reinshagen, Sunday's Children. So women playwrights being programmed by a woman director, and I think she also did Purgatory in Ingolstadt, Maria Louisa Fleischer play. So I was very aware of the kind of enrichment that happened when women did take charge. And I'm not quite sure who else. Maybe the Royal Exchange came a bit later, but there were...
Royal Exchange was a lot later.
Right, but there are beginning
in the
to...
2000s.
Or Theatre Clwyd with Helena Kauthausen and so on. There's gradual change beginning to take place when women do take over buildings. And so I felt there was a degree of optimism about that. And, I know that women playwrights I worked with, like April De Angelis, she was kind of beginning to make quite an established career. And again, Playhouse Creatures came through at some point, which is her big success. Winsome Pinnock, who had her first play with the Half Moon Young People's Theatre, and that's a very important area to mention, how much writing for young people's theatre, companies like Theatre Centre, where David Johnston has to be mentioned, who brought in women playwrights and then ended up setting up a women's company alongside the mixed company, and lots of women like Lisa Evans and so on got their careers started there. There were a lot of new talented women writers who were doing work there.
Mine was slightly different experience because I'd had such a wonderful free time at the Soho Theatre, and then the Arts Council said, you've got to close, you're the highest subsidised theatre in the country, so proceed. And I got the job as artistic director of Greenwich and went from what had been an amazingly supportive board and freedom to do what I wanted to a very large board of mainly old white men who loathed me very quickly. It became a soul-destroying struggle, really. And very frustrating because you could see towards the end of my time there, we did an Othello with a black Iago and a black Amelia and Asian Cypriots, and we did a joint production with the TIE company called Greenwich 1789 in tribute to Ariana Mushkini's 1789, which got audiences from places that Greenwich hadn't had audiences before, but it was too vicious a struggle for me. So I went into television as if that was going to be any more welcoming to women than theatre. But that I was yet to find out.
Sue Dunderdale, Susan Croft and Jill Lloyd with that tour of the women's theatre scene in the 1980s. Next time in Activism in the 80s, an epic strike, some extraordinary women, an adventurous playwright and a thrilling stage production.
To get to the strikers, there was no contact numbers.
Because it's about sacrifice and, the fact they're working class and what they went through.
His father pointed to the map and said, in this country, white people oppress other white people.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time in the final episode of Activism in the 80s.